jokingly said to Hannah when we were walking in, I said, maybe I should tell him tonight we're headed to Psalms next.
I don't get it.
Yeah. Oh, my. We've been in this book a while now.
Stony Creek, brother, at one time was in Exodus for almost 2 years.
Wow.
2 years.
And the Israelites, they were in the wilderness 40. So, yeah.
38 more.
Yeah, that's it. So we've got a little more time before we go too long. We're in Isaiah 54, and we're still in the same kind of context he just presented last time. Isaiah presented last time we read in 53 about the suffering servant who comes out of the Jewish nation, and Isaiah wouldn't have known who it was. He didn't know where to identify this individual. But the New Testament clues us in later and says, it was the Christ, it was Jesus. And so in 54:1, he says, "Sing, O barren, thou that didst not bear, break forth into singing, cry aloud, thou that didst not travail with child. For more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife, saith the Lord." And then it says in 2, "Enlarge the place of thy tent, and let them stretch forth the curtains of thine habitations. Spare not, lengthen thy cords, and strengthen thy stakes. For thou shalt break forth on the right hand and on the left, and thy seed shall inherit the Gentiles, and make the desolate cities to be inhabited." All of this is his way of saying that you've been in exile now for a while. You're looking really small. You're looking extinct. But you're going to flourish once more. You see, after they left Babylon, they were coming back home to this land that was once described in the Old Testament as flowing with milk and honey. And the land that we're talking about is just this little piece right here. We're talking about the land of Palestine. And so they're coming back out of Babylon, which is situated right about here. And they're coming back to the land. And this piece of property is only the size of a postage stamp. And God's telling them, I know you're coming home to this little piece of property, but you're going to be enlarged. And it's his way of saying to them in a very poetic way, you're going to multiply. You're going to be a great nation. Remember that covenant I made with Abraham? I'm going to vindicate that and show it to you again. So he says in 54 in verse 4, he says, "Fear not, don't doubt." And he says, "For thou shalt not be ashamed, neither be thou confounded. For thou shalt not be put to shame, for thou shalt forget the shame of thy youth, and shalt not remember the reproach of thy widowhood any more." You might notice that he's calling her in verse 1, he's calling the nation as if she were desolate or abandoned. She's going to be married again. In 54:4, it says that she was a widow, as it were. All of this, of course, is figurative. And then verse 5, "For thy Maker is thy husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, and thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. The God of the whole earth shall he be called." Well, did God need to wait until all of this to happen in order to be called the God of all the earth? No. Somebody get Genesis 18:25. Look at this one. This is just prior to the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah. Just prior to the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah, notice what Abraham says God is, or calls God. Whoever's got it, Genesis 18:25.
"Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous without the wicked, so that the righteous should be wicked. Far from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right."
He's called the judge of all the earth way back, long before the Babylonian exile. What you've got is distinct points in history where that truth manifests itself. And so once in Genesis 18, we have God being the Lord or the judge of all the earth. That truth is publicly displayed over the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's displayed here again in Isaiah 54 when they're going to exit the Babylonian exile. But there's one major event that stands out in our minds above all the rest, where God says to us, "I'm God, I'm Lord, I reign over all the earth." And that event is namely in the crucifixion and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it is through that act that we start to see an extreme case where God has said to all of humanity, "I reign, not you." And it's that truth that we see manifested in Acts chapter 2. And we'll pick up there when we get into the book of Acts in a couple years. We're getting there. And so anyway, in Isaiah 54 and verse 5, he says, "The God of the whole earth shall he be called." It's not that he wasn't named that already. but it's going to be demonstrated or manifested again. And so then in verse 6 he says, "For the Lord hath called thee as a woman forsaken, and grieved in spirit, and a wife of youth, when thou wast refused, saith thy God." Now here's a good passage. Look at 54:7. Sometimes we have this question when it comes to the Babylonian exile about whether or not God really forsook His covenant. And I'm going to give us a couple of passages here in a moment that present this sort of thing. But in the exile, the nation had been doing all right. And then in 722, Assyria moved in and captured the northern tribes and carried them off into captivity. And then a few years later, they took even Judah into exile, culminating in the fall of the temple, the destruction of the temple in 586. And in 586, they're all in exile for the most part. And God has to tell them about restoration. So after they're in captivity for 70 years, God brings them back to their land and they're living right again. Namely through the event in 539 with Cyrus when he sends them back home. How do we interpret this section of things? Did God abandon His people? Did God say, "You're no longer my people, I'm discarding you"? No, somebody read 54:7 for us.
For a small moment have I forsaken thee, but with great mercies will I gather thee.
He's saying, I forsook you, but it was for a small moment. This is not utter or complete rejection. What this is a temporary relapse. This is God's way of saying, I've worked with you guys for how many years now, and you still aren't getting the points? He says, for a moment, 70 years in exile, I've forsaken you. But then look at the text. He says in verse 7, "But with great mercies will I gather thee." Now, take a look, somebody, at Jeremiah 31. Jump over to Jeremiah 31. And look at one of these oracles that Jeremiah the prophet had delivered.
Drew, you may allude to this, but I'm just curious about the way you said, and well, you alluded to the scripture stating that you'd forsaken them. But it wasn't really God that forsook them, it was them turning their back on God, and He was just being God.
Yeah.
He was just,
Yeah.
He never changed or moved or did anything. It is interesting, though, the language that's used.
Yeah.
Because I guess to me, as a Jewish person, I would say, where's my God? Where is my refuge? Where,
Right.
But
That's,
if you look at it the right way, God never moved.
Yeah.
It was the Jewish people that...
And that's the question they're thinking. A lot of these people are sitting in captivity thinking, where's God in all of this? And so He's going to answer. He's going to tell us. Somebody read Jeremiah 31 and listen closely. Read closely and listen closely to Jeremiah 31 verses 35 through 37. Whoever's got it, go ahead.
Thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and of the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. The Lord of hosts is His name. When you want to read 36?
Yeah, 36 and 37.
If those ordinances depart from before me, saith the Lord, then the seed of Israel also shall cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus saith the Lord, if heaven above can be measured, and the foundations of the earth searched out beneath, I will also cast off all the seed of Israel for all that they have done, saith the Lord.
Oh, notice how He compares His covenant with Israel. He says, the day that I forsake my covenant with Israel will be the day when all of the cosmic bodies fail. Sun's gone, moon's gone, stars are gone. What's the point? God's letting us know how stable this covenant with Israel was. He's not going to forsake His people. And so one of the questions they started to ask when the exile hit was, did God abandon us? Are we alone now? Has He forsaken us? And so you have a certain writer who really toggles with this question. Jump over to Daniel 9. Look at this. And Daniel is asking the question. Now Daniel's one of those righteous ones, isn't he? Daniel's not wicked. And so he's feeling forsaken by God. So he's asking the kind of question, well, Lord, are you going to remain true to your covenant? Are you going to leave us in exile? Take a look at Daniel chapter 9. And this is, we could read 9:3 through 17. We don't have time for that. But take a look at 9:4. Where Daniel says, I prayed unto the Lord my God and made my confession and said, O Lord, the great and dreadful God, keeping the covenant and mercy to them that love him and to them that keep his commandments. He's questioning about whether or not God has now abandoned the Jews. Look later on. Take a look at 9 and verse, take a look at 16. Where he says this, O Lord, according to all thy righteousness, I beseech thee, let your anger and your fury be turned away from your city Jerusalem, your holy mountain. Because for our sins and the iniquities of our fathers, Jerusalem and thy people are become a reproach to all that are about us. And he says in 17, cause your face to shine upon thy sanctuary that lies desolate for the Lord's sake. See, Daniel is writing from this point right about here. This is where Daniel lives. Isaiah, he's prophesied all of this in advance. Isaiah's back here. But Daniel, he's living in the exile. And so he and all of the others sitting in captivity are questioning, has God forsaken us? And God is simply saying through Daniel, and that's why largely the book of Daniel was written, God is letting us know that no, he never utterly forsook them. He didn't abandon them. But the text says in Isaiah 54:7, he forsook them for a moment. So they would learn the lesson, and then he'd gather them right back. If you've read Psalm 89, Psalm 89 is one of those extensive psalms that talks about, it's David's psalm, really. It's attributed to Ethan. It's David's language. And it's God's way of saying to David, my covenant with you is established, it's sure. And then we might pick up on one of our most popular books of the Bible, and that's Romans, where Paul even asks the question in 11:1 of Romans, did God forsake his people? Has God abandoned his people? And he says, God forbid. I also am a Benjamite of the tribe of, or I'm an Israelite of the tribe of Benjamin. And he's basically saying, I haven't been forsaken. The point is this. God's got a couple of different groups of people. And there's one category, the covenant, the people that God made the covenant with, that will never be forsaken. In the Old Testament time, you've got Israel. Every physical Jew that exists. But within that, you've got a remnant. And these are those who live by faith. And it's that same kind of platform that's transposed into the New Testament key about you and me. And God's saying it doesn't matter what ethnicity you are, you better be those people who live by faith. And that's what Isaiah is trying to get through to the people who are camped out in exile over in Babylon. He's trying to get them to see, it doesn't matter that you're the son of Abraham. You've got to be living by your faith. You've got to be living by the system that God has delivered. And that's what some of them were not. So it didn't matter if they died in Babylon. It didn't matter if they died in the temple's court. They've got to be faithful. And that's what God's trying to get you and me to see as well. Go back to Isaiah 54 and take a look at verse 8. So Isaiah is trying to get that kind of thing through to them. And he says, in a little wrath I hid my face from thee for a moment, 54:8. But with everlasting kindness will I have mercy on thee, saith the Lord thy Redeemer. And then he starts to get reminiscent with us. He says, oh, let me talk to you about your history. He says, as the waters of Noah, that's how this is unto me. Remember the catastrophe that happened then? Remember how he destroyed the world? Remember how he also, through that catastrophe, saved the righteous? What do you think that means for you? What do you think it means for me? What do you think it meant for the people living in Isaiah's day? He's saying, you've seen this kind of thing before. You know I can do it again. And so he says in verse 9, as I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth, so have I sworn that I would not be wroth with thee, nor rebuke thee. The mountains will depart, the hills be removed. But God assures the people, my kindness will not depart, neither shall the covenant of my peace be removed, saith the Lord that hath mercy on thee. And so then he says in 11, O you afflicted, tossed with tempest, not comforted, behold, I'll lay thy stones with fair colors. Oh, listen to some of this. This is a point to pick up on. He says, I'll lay your stones with fair colors, and lay your foundations with sapphires. And I will make thy windows of agates, and thy gates of carbuncles. Keep that in mind. The gates are going to be with carbuncles. And all thy borders of pleasant stones. And then he says in 13, and all thy children shall be taught of the Lord, and great shall be the peace of thy children. In righteousness shalt thou be established. Thou shalt be far from oppression, Who's the oppressor in our context? Babylon. Yeah. Yeah, the oppressor is going to be brought low. God's people are going to be exalted. The oppressor is Babylon. The redeemed people are the faithful. And that's what God's assuring them of. Now watch this in 14. For thou shalt not fear, and from terror, for it shall not come near unto thee. And he says in 15, Behold, they shall surely gather together, but not by me. Whosoever shall gather together against thee shall fall for thy sake. Look at that at the end of 15. He says this, Whosoever is moving in against the people of God, it doesn't matter how big of an army you can muster up. God's going to handle it. And so we'll read the remainder of the chapter. It says in 16, I've created the smith that blows the coals in the fire. So if the smith were to oppose the people of God, it doesn't matter. God created the smith. The blacksmith, that is. It says in 16, And that bringeth forth an instrument for his work. Doesn't matter if the instrument's the mightiest sword of the land. God made the man who forged the sword. And so he says in 16, And I have created the waster to destroy, even Babylon, the person, the nation who had come in and ravaged the land. God created those people. And so he says in 17, No weapon that's formed against thee will prosper. Every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is of me, saith the Lord. Okay, I told you to remember a couple of those things. The main one was that the carbuncles were the gates. In verse 13. Somebody get Revelation 21:21. Look at this. Whoever's got Revelation 21. Go ahead.
The 12 gates were 12 pearls. Each individual gate was of 1 pearl. And the street of the city was pure glass on transparent glass.
In the context of Isaiah, Babylon's your oppressor. And so how is he going to tell the people sitting over there in the exile, we're going to reverse all of that. Instead of you being the oppressed ones, the trodden down people, we're going to see to it that you're the redeemed ones. How do we present that picture? Well, let's tell them that they're going to get a new city. One that has precious stones, new gates, all of that. And Isaiah, in speaking of redemption from Babylon, and the exile there, pictures these gates with carbuncles. And that pictures redemption. In John's context, in Revelation 21, we've got a different oppressor. It's Rome. And he's speaking to them about deliverance from the Roman threat. And says in Revelation 21:21, picturing a new city, the new Jerusalem as it were, he pictures their redemption not having gates with carbuncles. You know, these are less than pearls. John grabs a hold of Isaiah's imagery and kicks the door open wider and says, your city is going to be gleaming with pearls. Make sense? Do you see the similarity there? Yes, Norman.
Or a carbuncle is something like a bull with a bunch of heads and little people.
Google it. I don't know. I thought it was a stone. I read that it was a stone somewhere.
A severe abscess or multiple boil in the skin typically infected with a bacteria.
That's a little different, isn't it? Yeah. What did you say the New King James had? Crystal. We'll go with crystal.
Yeah,
Say that
the
one.
second definition is a bright red gem.
Bright red gem.
That's better.
Revelation 21:21. Are you talking about the Isaiah one? 54:13.
54:13.
Any other questions? Okay. If I don't know it, we can always pull up Google.
Once every time.
Carbuncle need a verse, and maybe that's me. Verse 12.
Is it verse 12?
Okay, I see it now.
Verse 12. I told you wrong.
Imagine that.
Yeah. I admit it. I admit it. And now, if you really want to know about my mistakes, ask my wife. So.
I made a few too.
I like to go home sometimes not.
Yeah. Oh my. One last point, and then we'll get into 55. What did we read about last week? What was our text about? If you could sum it up in one phrase or one thing. The Savior coming. What's another word for him? What's he typically called in the book of Isaiah? The Messiah, Savior, servant. That's the word I'm looking for. Anyway, they all mean the same thing in our context. But look at 54:17 again. Read that for us, somebody.
No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment you shall condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is from me, says the Lord.
Okay, I've put this model up a number of times, and I'm sure that this is the way we ought to go with this. There's a number of scholars, conservative scholars, who argue similarly. God gave the nation the task. They failed. He gives it to the remnant. They failed. He says we've got to find somebody who's sinlessly perfect. He gives it to the Messiah. And the Messiah is the servant of the Lord in 53. That's what Isaiah is ultimately getting at. There's a Messiah coming, a Savior coming, and whatever else you all said. There's somebody better who's coming, who's going to take away all of our problems. He's going to redeem us. But in 54:17, you've got that word in the plural. This is the heritage, the inheritance. This is what you, as servants, are to be a part of. And what Isaiah is doing is he's extending the work of the Messiah through the cross, through the resurrection. That's what Isaiah is talking about when it says his soul would be an offering for sin, 53:10, 53:11. He now takes the Messiah's work at the cross and extends that to all the world. And he says, the Jewish nation, they should identify with Jesus and his work. He's the outgrowth, he's the product of the Jewish nation, and they needed to look to him for Messiah. But to whom would the Gentiles look? God is saying to the prophet Isaiah that all of the servants should link themselves to this Jewish Messiah, and it's in him that the world would be blessed. That's what he promised to Abraham. He said, in him shall all nations of the earth be blessed. Now take a look at this one. Take a look at Colossians 1:24. We read about the suffering servant last week, and Isaiah is picking up on that theme once more. So somebody read Colossians 1:24.
Who now rejoice in my sufferings for you, and fill up that which is behind of the afflictions of Christ, in my flesh for his body's sake, which is the church.
Thank you, Randy. Paul is saying that his sufferings are the same sufferings as that of the suffering servant. Do you see that? When you suffer, so says Matthew 25 or Acts chapter 9, who suffers?
God.
Christ, God. Think about Acts 9 for a moment, where Paul's there on the road to Damascus, and the Lord appears to him in the way. And it says in Acts chapter 9, verses 4 through 6, he said, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who did Paul persecute? It was those Christians that he was dragging off to the city to have them killed. When you suffer, those sufferings are not your own. Those sufferings are for Christ. Look at 1 Peter chapter 4 and look at 16. We might look at a passage in 3 as well. So when we do suffer, we're right there with Christ in the affair, if we're doing it right. Take a look at 4:16. Read 15 and 16. We won't get the 1 and 3. 1 Peter 4:15 and 16.
But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. Yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on his behalf.
Yeah, so there you have it. When you take a beating in the name of Christ, when you get called the ugly name because of Jesus, something like that, your job, they start to reprimand you because you're not doing it right and you're not fitting in politically. Look, if it's all for the name of Christ, Continue to take the beating. You're in good company. Any other questions before we move into 55? Any other comments? Okay, take a look at 55:1. He says, "Ho, everyone that thirsteth, come to the waters. And he that has no money, don't worry about being poor. Come eat, buy, eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without price." God's going to provide for you. God's going to pay the bill. And he says in 2, "Wherefore do you spend money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which satisfieth not? Hearken diligently unto me, and eat ye that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness." In other words, God's saying, I'm going to restore you. The nation's going home. You're going to be redeemed. Don't sweat it. God's going to do this. And then look at who he promises all of this through in 3 through 5. He says in 55:3, "Turn your ear, incline your ear, and come unto me. Hear, and your soul shall live. I'll make an everlasting covenant with you, even the sure mercies of David." Well, that sounds nice. You don't have a better president to think of than David. That's how it was with the Jews. And so he says in 55:4, "I've given him as a witness," or a testimony. Anybody have another rendering there in 55:4? The King James has witness.
I made him a witness.
A witness? Okay, yeah, we've got witness. Anybody else? Testimony. He's a sign. He's a symbol. When they thought of David, what did they think of? Oh, he's that man. Well, he was just the shepherd boy. That's you. That's me. Oh, I was just working in the school district. Oh, I was just the barber. I was just a carpenter. I just drove a truck. That's the kind of guy that God grabbed a hold of. You see, God didn't need somebody great. David wasn't a great man, and therefore God used him. God used David, and therefore David was a great man. You see the difference? That's you, and that's me. And so God's grabbing a hold of people that were the little shepherd boy out there that didn't amount to much at all. And he grabbed a hold of him and said, I'll make sure that people see me through you. And that's what he's doing with us. He's making sure that God works through us to show his community as it ought to reflect the biblical text. And so we've got to reflect Christ. That's our mission. That's our life. And so he says in 55 that if he could grab a hold of David and do that, he stands as an emblem, as a sign, as a testimony to you and me that he can do the same thing with us. And he says in 5, "Behold, thou shalt call a nation that thou knowest not, and nations that knew not thee shall run unto thee because of the Lord thy God, and for the Holy One of Israel, for he hath glorified thee." I don't have enough time to read all of the passages, so I'm going to have to just tell you about them. Do you remember when they entered into the land of Canaan, and the 2 spies came to Rahab's house? And in Joshua chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, what does she say? "Oh, we've heard. We've heard. We know what's going out through the land. We know you've walked over the river. And we know that you're coming into this land to take it. We've seen what God did to the Egyptians. We've heard about those plagues. We heard about the death of his firstborn son, Pharaoh's that is." And Rahab says, "We all know these stories." What does Rahab want to do at this point? She grabs a hold of the Jews and she says, "Save me." And it's at this point that spies, of course, by God say, "Well, put down the red thread, and we'll see to it that you're saved." Rahab, being a faithful, though a Gentile, being a faithful person of God, by her faith is saved because she wants to link herself to where God resides. A little bit later, 1 Kings chapter 4, you've got people coming to Solomon's court. Why? Because they knew that God was with him. 1 Kings 4, about verses 24 through 31. And then you've got this certain individual, I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but Hiram, the king of Tyre, 1 Kings chapter 5. He wants to make a pact with Solomon. Why is this taking place? This is God's way of saying, when you manifest my glory, people are going to want to partake. And that's how it works. When God's glory goes forth, and I believe, and you believe it as well, I believe that when the gospel goes forth and we're actually dispensing the gospel truth of Christ and what he did on the cross, I believe that there are going to be honest, sincere hearts that want to partake in those blessings as well. And see, when we preach the unadulterated, pure gospel, and that's what Isaiah is doing, it's just a different mechanic. He's preaching the same gospel truths, redemption through God. But when he preaches that, even the Gentile nations who look at the Jewish nation, they're going to say, we want to be a part. That's how it ought to be with the Church of Christ. Somebody get Acts chapter 13. Look at this. This is a quotation of this passage. Somebody grab Acts 13, 33 and 34. Luke blends these two passages together. One's from the Psalms, Psalm 2, and the other is from this passage we're reading in Isaiah 55. Whoever's got it, Acts 13, 33 and 34.
He has fulfilled for us their children by raising up Jesus, as it is written in the second Psalm. You are my son today, I have become your father. God raised him from the dead so that he will never be subject to decay. As God has said, I will give you the holy and sure blessings promised to David.
So there you have that same kind of truth recurring once more. He's telling the church, the first century church, he's telling them even you can partake of the sure mercies of David. Who's he talking to? Look at 13:16. Acts 13:16. Paul stood up beckoning with his hand, said, Men of Israel, and the God-fearer, and the God-fearer in the book of Acts is always a Gentile. He says, even the Gentiles, listen up, even you Gentiles now can partake in the sure mercies of David. Oh, but he was a Jewish king. Yeah. Even if you're Gentiles, you can come to God through his Jewish Messiah, who stood as a type in David, looking forward to Jesus the Christ. Any questions before we move on to 55, Isaiah 55, verses 6 and following? Okay, here's a passage we might have heard before. Take a look at 55:6. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call ye upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return unto the Lord, and he will have mercy upon him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. And then you've heard this one before, 55:8, used out of context, where they say, well, God's thoughts are not our thoughts, neither are his ways our ways. That's not exactly what the passage is going for there, because he had just told them their thoughts should have been his thoughts, and their ways should have been his ways. It's not saying that we just aren't on the same plane as God. Now that's undebatably true. But the point that he's making here is they should have been. In this regard, they should have been equal to God. Their thoughts should have matched his. Their ways should have matched his. And that's what he's saying to you and me as well. He's saying that our motives and our movements, our actions, all of that ought to be in line with what God has operated for us. And so in verse 9, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. He's talking to reprobates here. I mean, he's not telling them that they just can't get on par with him. He's telling them, you need to be on par with me. I've been telling you that. You've been worshiping Baal. And we'll see that in the ensuing chapters. Take a look at verse 10. As the rain comes down, the snow comes down, and it returns not thither, but waters the earth, makes it bring forth and bud. You know the system. That it may give seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall it be with God's word. It's going to go out of his mouth, and it's not going to come back empty, as though it didn't do its task. But in 55:11, he says, it will accomplish that which I please, and it will prosper in the thing whereunto I sent it. What's he talking about? Is there a specific event or idea that God's got in mind when he tells them, my word is not going to be stunted or hindered? Yeah, somebody get 47:15 for us. Look at this. In 47:15. Whoever's got it, go ahead.
Thus shall they be unto thee, with whom thou hast labored, even thy merchants, from thy youth. They shall wander every one to his quarter. None shall save thee.
None shall save thee. Well, what if some wise guy out of Babylon got the idea, well, maybe we can prevent God from bringing judgment upon us? The word of the Lord on that account is not going to return to him void. Well, what about us? What about when God declares that he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved? Don't think that God's going to pull back the promises, you see. He's going to make good on his promises. And in this context, he's talking about a threat. He's going to make good on his threat against Babylon, and nobody's going to stunt that. Nobody's going to pull him back. What God says goes. And so in verse 12, you'll go out with joy, be led forth with peace. The mountains and the hills are pictured here as breaking forth before you into singing. The trees of the field will clap their hands. We need to tell Hal Lindsey to get on board with reading some of this figuratively. In 55:13, instead of the thorn shall come up the fir tree, and instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle tree, and it shall be to the Lord for a name, for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. God's going to redeem His people, and that's what He's going to say over and over again, even to the remainder of the book. Any questions on 55? Any comments? Okay, so then in 56:1, he tells us, and he's got imminence involved. We know this has to refer to the Babylonian affair. He says that his salvation is near. It's close. It's imminent. He's talking about redemption from exile. And so he says, keep judgment, do justice. Salvation is near to come. My righteousness will be revealed in all of this. God's going to show who He really is. And so in 56:2, blessed is the man that doeth this, and the Son of Man that layeth hold on it, that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and keepeth his hand from doing any evil. Okay, we get into this section now in 3 through 8, where he's going to make a couple of promises. And he makes the promises to two different groups of people. One is the Gentiles, the foreigners, and the second are the eunuchs. Under the Torah, under the Pentateuch, the eunuch could not go into the house of the Lord. So says Deuteronomy 23:1 through following. If this were all literal, Isaiah is actually preaching a contradiction to the Mosaic Law. And we'll see that. Take a look at 56:3. Neither let the son of the stranger, the Gentile, the foreigner, that hath joined himself to the Lord, don't let him speak, saying, well, the Lord has utterly separated me from His people. In other words, Isaiah is saying, no, don't let the Gentile say that he's a separate group or a second-rate individual. Don't be separate. He's allowed in now. Look at this in 56:3. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am considered a dry tree. God is saying, no, even the eunuch now is going to be invited in as a first-rate individual. Under the Mosaic Law, this would be fatal. This would not be in accordance with the Torah. So says Deuteronomy 23. This lets us know something. Obviously, the section is figurative. It has to be. Otherwise, you've got an outright contradiction. Isaiah is a false prophet of God. You've got problems all over if it's not figurative language. So he says in verse 4, for thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths, and choose the things that please me, and take hold of my covenant, even to them will I give in mine house and within my walls a place and a name better than of sons and of daughters. I'll give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Also, the sons of the stranger that join themselves to the Lord to serve Him and to love the name of the Lord, to be His servants. Again, there you've got that word servants. He's going back to 53. Even the Gentiles and the eunuchs, everybody has been invited in to be linked with the servant, the suffering servant. And so he says in 56 and verse 6, everybody's going to be a servant. Everyone that keeps the Sabbath from polluting it. He says Sabbath. We're in a figurative context, and I'll work with that here in just a second. And takes hold of my covenant. Even them, I'm going to bring them all to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon mine altar. And then look at this last portion of 7. For mine house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. Anybody remember where that's quoted in the New Testament? Anybody have a cross-reference?
Cleaning the temple out.
Yes, cleaning the temple out. Matthew 21. Or perhaps there's a parallel with John 2.
Matthew 21:13.
That's it. 21:13 through the unit there is through verse 17. Christ goes in and He takes the scourge, or in another account He takes the whips. It's probably that there are two different historical accounts where He does this. But He takes the scourge in the one, He takes the whips in the other, and drives the people out of the temple. The Pharisees, the money changers who have been making merchandise in the temple. And He tells them, you've made my house a den of thieves. He quotes the Psalms, he quotes Isaiah, and he's saying, it was a house of prayer, and you've turned it into a riotous place. Why does he grab a hold of this passage? Why does Christ grab a hold of this text? He's trying to let those wicked Jews who have been like locking down Christianity, Judaism, of course, but they've been placing like this hold on religion. Well, if you want to get to God, you've got to come through us and you've got to pay us a certain amount of money. Well, that's great and all, but that's not what the Torah said. That's not what Jesus has said. That's never been God's intention. And God is telling them, you better stop telling people you've got to do it the Pharisees' way. You've got to do it God's way is the point. And so he's getting through to them that all the world, even the Gentiles now, are not considered second rate. The eunuch, he's not considered second rate. The man who's got leprosy is not considered second rate. All of those people that they had started treating horribly under the Old Testament code because they thought that they were somehow better than him. They were the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the lawyers and the doctors of the law, you see. They started treating all the little guys like they were nothing. And that's why God's reminding us of David. That's why God's reminding us of people like Abraham. People who, without God, amounted just about to nothing. And it's because God grabbed a hold of them that He made them great. He's letting the Jews know that He'll do the same thing with the Gentiles and the foreigners if He wishes. So in Isaiah chapter 56, what He's doing is He's painting a picture, and we've got to go one of three ways with it. Here are your three options. The first way is to go literally. You say, well, we should interpret all of this literally. There's a school down in Texas, Dallas Theological Seminary, who tells us that we ought to read everything in the Bible literally. You know that's false. I mean, the text says in Luke 3 that John came to lift up the valleys and humble the mountains. How about this one? In Luke 13, he says, go tell Herod that fox. Or better yet, John 10:9, he says, I am the door, Jesus says. You get the idea. Not literal. The second option is to say it's figurative, but we've got to specify what we mean by that. Allegorical. An allegory is something where everything has like a representation. So this item, Sabbath, actually is a figure of speech for Sunday. King David is actually a symbol for Jesus the Christ. And we do that kind of thing. I don't buy that either. You've got problems with that view where you've got to then make everything fit like some secondary item. Here's my favorite view. I think it's a figurative picture indeed. But I think the scene is more collective. We don't need to get every item to have some kind of representation. Where a eunuch stands as a representation for somebody else. A foreigner stands as a representation for somebody else. And we don't have to have all of this equaled out somehow. All it's doing is this. To sum it up in one line, God in Isaiah 56, 3-8 is saying the whole picture speaks of blessing. And He preaches it in the way that the Jew could understand. He can't tell them about a cappella singing. He can't tell them about water baptism. He can't tell them about Lord's Suppers. How do you preach to a Jew in the exile that better days are ahead? Paint a picture where everybody's invited into the temple to partake in the Sabbath day. Literally? No. Figuratively? Yes. That's a picture we can all get on board with, isn't it? That's the kind of thing He's telling the Jews. A better day is ahead. Everybody's going to be invited in to partake in the blessings of God. Okay. Any questions before we look at 9? 56:9, that is. How much time do we have left?
3 or 4 minutes.
Okay. We've got enough time to get through chapter 6.
It's funny, back in 50, I believe it's 55:3, where He said, turn your ear, if you're here, you'll live. It's just like today, you mentioned baptism. People say, well, I just can't see Jesus or the power in that water.
Yeah.
I can't see it. He didn't ask you to see the power. He asked you to believe it.
Yeah.
We believe there's power in gasoline, because when we put it in the car, we see that there's power in it.
Yeah.
So people, I don't understand when they look at the Bible, they can't believe what Jesus says. And it's the same way these people look at a lot of things. And the Lord's saying, you need to hear if you want to live.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The biggest problem in a lot of cases, it's not understanding. It's not that we're not educated enough to get it. It's strictly unbelief. Think about it. Most of our problems in the world today, what's it from? Pride, unbelief. People don't want to do it God's way. It's not, I mean, God has not given us, admittedly, there are difficult texts in the Bible. But God's given it to us understandably so we can find Him in all of this. Joe.
If they were crazy enough to think they wanted to see literal power in that water, just toss in a toaster.
I've never tried that, Joe. We'll show it to you. Okay, how many minutes now? 3. Okay, I like 3 better. I won't get into any more of this, but let me tell you this. Take a look at 57. Look at 57:5. We'll come back and hit this next week. But in 57:5, he talks about inflaming themselves with idols. The idols were a problem only before the exile. Meaning, if here's the exile, 586, Isaiah is our prophet. He's back here. The idols are a problem in Isaiah's day. Why do you think he's talking about idols? Look at the next thing he lists. He says, slaying the children. There's one king who was notorious for that. That was Manasseh, who was a contemporary of Isaiah. And so he talks about murder of the children, that is, slaying them upon the altar, even offering them up before pagan gods. And then look at one more in 57:5. He says, in the valleys under the cliffs of the rocks. And then he goes on to talk about the lofty and high mountain. He's talking about their idolatrous practices. So once again, he's talking about the high places. Here's the point. These sins that we've seen in 57 are only before the exile, before the Babylonian affair. They do not ever recur after the exile. What's the point? Isaiah is speaking in his own day, 8th century. But he has creatively taken his whole day and projected them forward as if they're living 200 years later. What's the point? That's the sign of a prophet. You see, the critical school tells us that this is actually then written by a second author, or maybe these things actually did show up again afterwards. That's not the truth. What you're working with is a prophet of God who actually miraculously could manifest his time and project it 200 years into the future as if that generation is the one he's addressing 200 years later. I don't know if you get the fullness of that point. We'll pick up there next week. Thanks for your